The ruling class. Elementi di Scienza Politica. Gaetano Mosca. Translation by Hannah D. Kahn. Edited and revised, with an introduction, by Arthur Livingston. 1896. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Chapter 13. Types of Political Organization. 1. A glance at the various methods by which human societies, which have achieved a certain development and acquired a place in world history, have constituted themselves and have functioned furnishes perhaps the most suitable way of bringing out the importance that the ruling class has in any social organization. The anatomical differences, so to speak, that we find in such societies and the types into which the differences can be grouped correspond to the differing formations and the differing manners of functioning of their ruling classes. An investigation something like the one we are about to make was undertaken some 80 years ago by Spencer, and after him by the members of his school. In trying to found their new science, which they called sociology, following Comte's example, they thought it expedient to divide all political organizations into two fundamental types, the militant and the industrial. The inadequacies of that classification we noted above, Chapter 3, Sections 11 to 12, and we also saw that the germ of truth it contained was sterilized and lost because of a one-sided and incomplete view of the facts of which it was supposed to facilitate an analysis. The outlook that governed the researches of the Spencerians, and the materials they used to build up the new science which they were trying to found, doubtless contributed very substantially to the barrenness of that particular classification, and in general of all corollary doctrines of Spencer and his followers. They started out on the assumption that the simplest and most primitive types of social organization, and therefore small tribes of savages or semi-savages, reveal in embryonic form the various types of political organization that are to be found in peoples who have reached a certain level of civilization and have organized into political units of some magnitude. The Spencerians derived their facts, therefore, largely from the narratives of travelers who had had closest contacts with the more primitive peoples. Ignoring other objections to this method that might be made, it seems to us obvious that, as happens in the case of plants and animals, in which primitive types necessarily resemble each other because one simple cell will always be like another cell, differentiation in social organisms necessarily becomes greater in proportion as the organisms develop and grow complex. A small horde of savages, such as still wander about in the interior of Australia, will be peaceful or warlike according to the abundance or scantiness of its means of subsistence or the nature of the peoples with which it comes into contact. But political organization in such a horde will come down to the mere predominance of the strongest, most intelligent and shrewdest male, and generally of the best hunter or the best fighter. The experience of some old man or woman may well be held in a certain esteem. But it seems impossible that distinctions of class could exist in primitive social organisms of this type. Such distinctions can be based only upon a permanent differentiation in occupation. There comes a time when the primitive stage has been definitely passed, when the subsistence of the horde is based on pastoral pursuits and even on a rudimentary agriculture. Such a horde is a tribe that includes, according to the case, various groups of huts, or even a town or a number of villages. A certain specialization of function begins to take shape, and therefore a certain order of social ranking. Even so, the political types that we meet in all such organisms, which have not passed the first phases of their development, present considerable similarities in all races and in all latitudes. Whether the tribe is still nomadic or semi-nomadic or already has a fixed abode, it will always have a chief who is supreme judge, military leader and priest, when the tribe has special protecting gods. But in all questions of importance this chief must consult a council of elders, and he makes no decisions without their consent. In questions of greater importance the decisions he reaches with the elders have to be approved by the assembly of all the members of the tribe, in other words, all the adults who are not slaves nor outsiders to whom the tribe has accorded its protection but whom it has not yet taken into its membership by adoption or by some other legal fiction. That is the organization we find described in Homer. Almost identical is the organization that Tacitus met among the Germans of his day, and we find the same thing in the Arab tribes of Asia or the Arabo-Berber tribes of North Africa, though in the latter, because of the prevailing Islamism, the chief has virtually lost all religious status. Nor would any other type of organization be possible under such social conditions. Though the chief belongs ordinarily to the richest and most influential family in the tribe, he cannot enforce obedience unless he has first come to an understanding with other members who are influential because of wealth and number of supporters or because of some special reputation for wisdom. The mass of freemen, further, when gathered in assembly, does not take an active part in discussion, as a rule. It limits itself to approving the proposals of the elders by applause or disapproving them by grumbling. The leaders usually have taken the precaution of first coming to an understanding with each other, and, already skilled in the arts of mob leadership, they sometimes have apportioned the roles they are to recite beforehand. In these political organisms that are in an early stage of development, a rudimentary differentiation of classes usually begins to take form, based upon inheritance of economic and political position. Often the position of high chief is hereditary, but, as happens today among the Arabo-Berber tribes, the son is not likely to succeed the father if he has by any chance shown himself incompetent to hold the supreme office in respect of intelligence, tact and character, and unless he is supported by large numbers of relatives and dependents and has a considerable private fortune. So it is with the elders. They are always esteemed for ancestral luster, but that alone is not enough to enable them to hold their political position. In some tribes there is no real chief because jealous elders will not tolerate one. But there is almost always one among the elders who manages to acquire a de facto leadership. That seems to be the situation today in a number of Arabo-Berber tribes in Cyrenaica. Often two families of influence are rivals for first place. So originate the kofs, or parties, that often throw the Arabo-Berber tribes into turmoil. And Homer relates that Antinous, son of Eupeithes, one of the suitors, aspired to become king of Ithaca by killing Clemachus, son of Ulysses. Of course, later on, when the tribe has developed far enough to be a sort of nation, with some tens of thousands of inhabitants, its political organization tends to change, and the change occurs, in general, in the direction of a greater differentiation between social classes. The elders acquire greater influence and try to strengthen and systematize their control over the masses. Gallic populations of the time of Caesar were farther advanced economically and politically than the Germans of the time of Tacitus. Caesar says of their political organization, quite generally in Gaul the people who count for something in numbers or prestige are of two classes, druids and knights. The common people are virtually slaves. They take no initiative of their own and are admitted to no counsel. The Saxons of Charlemagne's day were certainly farther developed socially than Tacitus's Germans. Clearly distinguishable among them are two classes, the nobles, or adelings, and plain freemen, or freilings. 2. But a moment must have come, we shall probably never know just when one tribe was able to absorb or subject enough neighboring tribes to develop into a nation, create a civilization and set up a political organization of some magnitude and sufficiently compact to combine and coordinate individual efforts and energies in considerable numbers, and to direct them toward attaining common public ends, whether of war or peace. This means that it must have been able to organize fairly large and fairly well-disciplined armies and keep them in the field. It may have been able to construct impressive buildings and, more probably still, to increase the productivity of the soil by complex and carefully planned irrigation systems. Nature could not have advanced by leaps and spurts in this development, either. The rise of the first great states must have followed long periods of gradual elaboration, during which the primitive town, which was the tribal capital, began to be a city. Progress in agriculture must have been such as to permit a relatively large number of men to live close together in a relatively small territory, and to allow political organization to become more vigorous and less rudimentary than anything described above. During this preparatory period certain arts and trades had probably advanced to some extent, and a first accumulation of capital had occurred in the form of stores of food or implements of war and peace. In that early day, writing, though still imperfect, must have begun to fix remembrances of the past and to facilitate transmission of the ideas and experience of one generation to generations following. The first founding of a great empire that can be dated approximately by historical documents was that of the Empire of Sargon I, called the Elder, king of Akkad in Chaldea, about 3000 BC. It is possible that similar efforts may have been made a century or more earlier by the kings of Lagash and Sumer. Sargon's empire extended from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean and the Sinai Peninsula. If it really was the most ancient of the great political organisms, it marks a decisive step in the history of human civilization. It seems to have lasted less than a century, however, falling apart into a number of rival kingdoms after the death of Naram Sin, third in line of succession from Sargon. But the example set by that early conqueror was to find imitators, and other great empires were to rise in epochs still remote, first in Lower and later in Upper Mesopotamia. Babylonia was situated in an almost intermediate position between the upper and the lower valleys of the Euphrates and the Tigris. For 16 centuries, the long era that elapses between Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian Empire very probably represented the greatest concentration of population, wealth and culture that the world had seen down to that time. Perhaps some time before the day of Sargon, Menes, founder of the first Egyptian dynasty, had welded the little states, into which Upper and Lower Egypt had previously been subdivided, into a single state. So resulted an empire and a center of civilization which rivaled the Mesopotamian Empire and were to last as long, with several periods of eclipse. The little we know about the political organization of these two very ancient empires in Mesopotamia and Egypt indicates that at the vertex of the social pyramid stood a sovereign. He had a sacred character, offering sacrifices to the national deity in the name of the people. The deity held the guardianship of the empire. At Thebes, in Egypt, his name was Ammon, in Babylonia it was Marduk, and in Nineveh, Aslier, see above, chapter 3, section 3. All civil and military powers were exercised in the name of the sovereign by a large body of officials, who were chosen ordinarily from the notables belonging to the race that had founded the empire. Subject peoples often kept their hereditary local leaders and preserved a certain autonomy. Sometimes they were wholly absorbed by the conquering people and blended with it. In such cases local officials were appointed and dismissed by the king directly, or rather by the court and in the court. It has been possible to establish that during the immensely long life of the Egyptian nationality the two systems replaced each other several times, according as the empire would grow stronger and more centralized for a time, or weaker and more centrifugal. The ruling class was usually made up of generals and priests, but both in Egypt and in Chaldea the priests were the repositories of all the learning of their day. They alone knew the laws, and the administration of the law devolved upon them. There were even cases where the high priests managed to replace secular powers and exercised royal authority. So in Upper Egypt, in the 9th century BC, the high priests of Amen exercised what today would be called temporal power. As for the system of recruiting civil and military officials, it has been possible to determine that methods varied widely, especially in ancient Egypt during the 3,000 years, more or less, of its history. As we have seen, chapter 2, section 6 and 8, there were periods when exact knowledge of hieroglyphic writing was the key that opened the doors to higher offices, whether civil or military, and there were cases where commoners attained high rank. But as a rule, even if there were no really closed castes in Egypt, the social hierarchy did have great stability, and a man was the child of his father rather than of his own works. In Babylonia, slaves were numerous, and almost all Egyptian documents and monuments testify to the luxury that the upper class displayed both in this life and in the next, while an intense and often forced manual labor was the normal lot of the lowly placed. Greek writers incidentally throw a good deal of light on the social and political conditions that prevailed in the Persian Empire, the last great government to flourish in the Near East before the Christian era. Greece had frequent contacts with it. It appears that birth had great importance in the constitution of the political hierarchy. Herodotus relates that the false Smerdis was able to become king by making people believe that he was the son of Cyrus. After he was murdered, 7 Persian noblemen occupied the throne in turn. According to Xenophon, when the younger Cyrus died at Cunaxa, the Greek mercenaries offered the crown to Arius, commander of the Persian troops that had fought with Cyrus. Arius refused, on the ground that he was not noble enough, that the Persian grandees would never accept him as king. The Greeks also preserved the fact that the Persian Empire was at bottom a more or less voluntary confederation of peoples of differing and more or less ancient civilizations, under the hegemony of Persia. Some peoples, such as the Armenians, the Cilicians and the citizens of Tyre, kept their autonomy and their national sovereigns. Others, such as the Lydians and the Babylonians, were governed by satraps, who were chosen from among great nobles at the Persian court of Susa. Over them the court kept strict surveillance. Almost all the subject nations paid annual tribute to the court of Susa, according to their wealth, and they furnished auxiliary troops as required. In the full midst of subject provinces, certain mountaineer populations maintained a savage de facto independence. That was the case with the Kardashians, who correspond, roughly, to the Kurds of today. In the Middle Ages, the Mohammedan state was founded largely on the pattern of the Near Eastern state. No doubt it borrowed some few details of its administrative and political system from Byzantium, but to a much greater extent it followed the examples and traditions of the Neo-Persian Empire of the Sassanids. Persian influence became preponderant especially under the Abbasid caliphs. The very title of the prime minister, vizier, was of Persian origin. However, in spite of the stiff religious cement that was the strength of its dominant class, in spite of the fact also that at certain periods it developed a high level of culture, the Mohammedan state had innate weaknesses that inevitably produced a more or less rapid disintegration of the great political organisms which the overpowering impetuousness of the early Islamic generations had created. Almost all social and political relations in the Musulman world were regulated by a religious code, in other words by the Quran. This, in the long run, arrested Mohammedan development. But, ignoring that, one of the most frequent causes for the rapid breaking up of the Musulman states was the practice of allowing governors of separate provinces to conscript troops, and to collect directly the taxes that paid for them. Such a concentration of power in their hands made it easy for them to create personal followings in their armies, so that they could proclaim their independence, or at least become independent in fact, though paying a nominal deference to the caliph. This defect was noted by Croz, one of the strongest intellects that Mohammedan civilization produced in its best days. China, too, down to a few years ago, was organized politically along the lines of the Near Eastern state, but over the course of long centuries she brought the type to a level of perfection that it attained nowhere else. This was due to the fact that Chinese civilization was based on a non-religious, positive morality, to the great unity of culture that the Chinese peoples achieved over many centuries of common history and, finally, to the democratic system of recruiting officials, who were appointed and promoted by competitive examination. In spite of these good points, the strength of the Chinese state was almost never proportionate to its size, and the inferiority of its political machine became promptly manifest once it came into contact with modern European states. In order to conserve her independence and her ancient national spirit, Japan was obliged rapidly to overhaul her political, administrative and military organization and conform to the models that the countries of European civilization supplied. The organization of empires of the Near Eastern type has always proved inferior to the organization of modern states of European civilization. It was inferior to the organization of the ancient Roman Empire and, in many respects, even to the organization of the little Hellenic states of the classical period. However, the vicissitudes of the ancient empires of the Near East are gradually coming to light, as the old hieroglyphic and cuneiform inscriptions are deciphered. It would be unfair to forget that through them mankind was able to accumulate the first stores of experience and wealth that were required for making intellectual and economic progress possible. On the banks of the Tigris, the Euphrates and the Nile, the groups of elders that had once ruled scattered tribes fused for the first time, and organized real ruling classes which had a chance to conceive and develop the idea that there were great interests that could be common to millions of human beings. In those classes, for the first time, a process of selection was able to operate whereby a certain number of individuals could be freed of the material cares of life. Sheltered by the organization of which they were apart from the greed and the violence of those who, in every age and in every society, are eager to get the best positions for themselves, such privileged individuals were enabled to devote their time to observing man and the world he lives in, and to elaborating the first rudiments of a morality for the family and for social groups. Those rudiments we find stated about 4,000 years ago in the Code of Hammurabi, which already sanctions many of the rules that the individual has to observe if society is to endure. The ancient Egyptian Rook of the Dead is in parts older than the Code of Hammurabi, some of its texts going back to the 11th dynasty, and the most recent ones to the 18th, about 1400 BC. This collection of sacred precepts was placed in tombs, perhaps as a sacred gesture, perhaps so that the dead might have some guidance in the life to come. The texts formulate for the first time a number of moral precepts and rules of brotherly consideration that later were to become basic in the great universal religions, for example, feed the hungry, give the thirsty to drink, cheat not the worker of his wage. Eschew falsehood, bear no false witness. In those empires, finally, the first trials were made in the difficult art of public administration. That art, in the last analysis, comes down to enabling a great society, with the least possible constraint, to see to it that the activity which each individual carries on spontaneously for his own advantage shall be useful to the group as a whole. 3. If European civilization has been able to create a type of political organization that is profoundly different from that of the Near Eastern Empire, the fact is due in very large part to the intellectual legacy left by Greece and Rome. There are of course wide differences between a great modern European or American state and the Athenian or Spartan state, or the Roman state during the Republican period. But had it not been for the writings of political thinkers of the classical age, whose minds were formed by the political institutions they could see operating before their eyes, modern Europe, and the countries that were colonized by Europeans beyond the seas, would not have adopted the political systems that distinguish them so sharply from the Asiatic empires. Greece borrowed many elements of her civilization from the nearest of the Asiatic empires and from Egypt. The first infiltrations must have taken place during a prehistoric period, when a pre-Hellenic civilization flowered, with Crete as its center, and then vanished, leaving only vague memories of itself. But this civilization developed the rudiments of agricultural science and made other material advances. Such things may deteriorate, once they have made their way into the customs of a country, but they seem never wholly to disappear, even if the nation or civilization that first invented or adopted them is destroyed. Other infiltrations from Egypt and the Near East came in the period when a truly Hellenic culture was reawakening. In other words, by the beginning of the 9th century BC. At that time the Phoenicians were the main intermediaries between Greece, Egypt and the Near East. On this occasion the new seeds that were transplanted to the soil of Hellas bore somewhat different, and in many respects better, fruits than did the plant from which they came, especially in the respects of art, Science and political organization. The Homeric kingdom, which we find at the dawn of the Second Greek civilization, was not very different from the semi-primitive type of social organization that appears in all peoples which have ascended only the first rungs of the ladder that leads to the great modern political structures. The Homeric king in many respects resembled the chief of the Arabian or Germanic tribe. His authority was primarily moral, and it had a religious aspect. He governed with the aid of a council of notables and, in weightier crises, summoned his warriors, or the freemen who belonged to the tribe, to an assembly. Yet, in a space of time that cannot be greater than 3 centuries, this type of political organization, which had few unusual traits about it, is transformed into the highly original Greek city of the classical era. As for the causes of this development, it may be noted first of all that the topography of Greece hampered the formation of great empires such as were able to rise in the broad, level valleys of the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Nile and the Yellow River. The surface of the Greek peninsula is so broken that every district, every town, with the territory roundabout, is cut off by fairly serious natural barriers from neighboring districts. The Greek tribes, therefore, acquired relatively stable residences, and private ownership of land had become customary by the time of Horner. These two circumstances allowed agriculture to develop so that a large population was able to subsist on a small territory. A Greek city of the classical period generally lay a good day's journey from its nearest neighbor. Its territory rarely exceeded 1,000 square miles. Given the agricultural development of the period, that amount of land could support 30 or 40,000 persons, including of course slaves and resident aliens. The village or primitive town became a populous city very easily. Attica had a territory of about 2,000 square miles. In its heyday its population may have exceeded 200,000. Syracuse and Sparta also had larger territories and populations than the normal Greek city. Now Athens, Syracuse and Sparta were the largest and strongest states of the ancient Hellenic world. The powerful organization of the ancient Greek clans also may have contributed to the different political development of Greece as compared with the Near East. Every group of families that considered itself descended from a common ancestor retained a certain amount of political and religious autonomy in the beginning, so that the city was a sort of confederation of clans. But besides these factors, there must have been others of an intellectual and moral order which, because of the remoteness of the time and the dearth of documents, we cannot discern or analyze very exactly. These factors we are forced to define with a very generic and imperfect phrase, as products of the peculiar genius of the Hellenic stock and, later on, of the Italic. In any event, the early Greek kingship eventually began to lose ground, and it had fallen into desuetude in Hellas perhaps less than a century after Homer's time. Hesiod already speaks of kings far less respectfully than Homer does. He who was called the peasant's poet accuses them of trafficking in justice, describes them outright as devourers of gifts and warmly recommends that his brother Perseus have nothing to do with them. The king either disappeared or lost his importance altogether in the council of notables. The city came to be governed by the heads of the phratries, or clans, or by groups of the oldest and most influential families, who owned the best lands and had them cultivated by slaves or by the throng of ne'er-do-wells and refugees from other countries whom every city used to accept, once an influential citizen could be found to accord them patronage. The dominant political organ, therefore, was the ancient Senate, or Council of Elders, in which the principal families were represented. The old assembly of all the citizens probably continued to function alongside the Council of Elders. But, because of a growing concentration of property and the large number of clients that the leading families could control, the council retained, for some time at least, the ascendancy that it had enjoyed in the monarchical era. In a period that must correspond, roughly, to the 7th century BC, progress in agriculture and an incipient commerce must have provided many of the descendants of resident aliens of long standing with the means to create independent economic positions for themselves. They began to crave admission to citizenship, that being the only way to share in the functions of government and to escape the onerous supervision of the elders. The movement must have been seconded by the poorer and obscurer families of old citizens, who also had an interest in fighting the oligarchical system which the richer and more illustrious families had instituted. These causes are of an economic order more especially. There were others. A change in armament and military tactics occurred about this time and must have contributed to the democratization of the Greek city. War chariots had been in use in the Homeric age, when they were the arm, so to speak, that decided the outcome of a battle. Only very wealthy persons could afford chariots. Now they came to be replaced by plain cavalry, and later on by hoplites, or heavily armed infantrymen. Hoplites formed the backbone of the Greek armies during the classical period. The equipment of a hoplite, though relatively costly, was within the reach of a man of moderate income. In Draco's constitution, which antedated Solon's, participation in public office by all who are supplied with arms appears as a long-recognized right. A period of civil conflict ensued, during which the losing parties often had to emigrate. Traces of this period are found in the poets of the age, notably in the verses of Theonis of Megara. It was at times broken by dictatorships of popular leaders, who were called tyrants. Such conflicts generally ended in compromises of the sort that Solon effected in Athens in the early decades of the 6th century BC, and the compromises resulted in that constitution of the Greek city-state of the classical age which was destined to have such a great significance in the political history of the world. The basis of these compromises were in the main two. First, admission to citizenship of a certain number of descendants of old resident aliens or emancipated slaves. There was no application of this principle, however, to cases arising subsequent to the reform of the constitution. New resident aliens were, on the whole, still barred from citizenship, so that even in democratic Athens the sons of a citizen and a woman who was not of Athenian birth could not be admitted to citizenship. Second, explicit recognition that sovereign power rested with the assembly of all the citizens. Over this route the citizen assembly gradually absorbed almost all the old prerogatives of the clan, which the heads of aristocratic families had formerly exercised over people of their own blood. The Council of Elders lost prestige proportionately, and as a rule it was transformed into a Senate, which was very often a direct emanation of the assembly having the right to determine its membership. Classical antiquity never knew that clean-cut separation of legislative, executive and judiciary powers which, theoretically at least, is one of the outstanding characteristics of modern constitutions. Even in the period of the Empire in Rome, complete separation of judiciary and administrative functions, which is a most familiar concept to us, had not been introduced. The Roman praetor could exercise functions that would now be called legislative. But in classical Hellas, what would now correspond to the sovereign power par excellence, in other words the legislative power, was entrusted almost exclusively to the assembly of citizens, while what we would call executive and judiciary functions were delegated to bodies, or individuals, that were almost always elected by all the citizens, or chosen by lot from among all citizens or specified classes of citizens. Aristotle enumerates the many public offices that were considered necessary for the proper functioning of the Greek commonwealth. They busied thousands of citizens, and the incumbents were for the most part chosen by lot. Characteristic of almost all the constitutions of the Hellenic cities was temporary tenure of office, the incumbents generally being renewed at least once a year. Just as common was the rule that more than one person should exercise the given public function. This custom was designed to provide that the power of an individual should always be controlled and limited by the equal power of one or more other individuals. That was the idea of the two consuls in Rome. The principle was so conscientiously applied that, in many Greek cities, command of the army or navy in war was entrusted to a number of polemarchs or navarchs who functioned in rotation. Characteristic again of the political and administrative organization of the Greek state was the almost complete lack of what would now be called salaried office holders. It is interesting to note that a number of judiciary and executive prerogatives which were held to be of great importance were ordinarily reserved for the popular assembly. The assembly almost always retained the right to declare war, to make peace and to apply the heavier penalties, death or exile. At the very least an appeal to the popular assembly was allowed in these latter cases. There was no standing army. As Aristotle reports, on reaching the age of 18 all Ephebi, sons of Athenian citizens, served a year in military training and then 2 more years as armed guards on the coast and at other strategic points in Attica. At bottom, therefore, Athens had what would now be called 3 years' service. However, there was no permanent body of officers. The people merely chose, each year, 5 honorable citizens over 40 years of age who managed the affairs of the corps of Ephebi and superintended the commissary. Each Ephebus received 4 obols a day for his maintenance. Then there were 2 instructors in gymnastics, who taught the manual of arms and commanded military drill. There were no standard regulations for discipline and no military penal code. In times of peace at least, the Ephebus was subject to the same jurisdictions as any other citizen. There is no indication in the history of Athens that would lead one to suppose that the body of Ephebi had anything to do with what we would now call police duty, the task of upholding the government or of maintaining public order. 4. Beginning with Herodotus, all the Greek writers of the classical period recognized the existence of 3 forms of government: monarchy, aristocracy and democracy. Herodotus puts into the mouths of 3 of the Persian nobles who killed the false Smerdis a dispute as to the merits and defects of the 3 forms. The anecdote has little plausibility as history, but it proves at least that as early as the middle of the 5th century BC, more than a century before Aristotle began to write, the Greeks, not the Persians, were familiar with the three categories and were exercising their critical talents in debating the advantages and drawbacks of each type of government. That the thinkers of classical Hellas should have stressed the importance of the monarchical system among the possible forms of government is readily comprehensible. Memories of the Homeric monarchy were prominent in their literary tradition. There had been recent examples of tyrannies, they were especially common in the Hellenic colonies, in Magna Graecia and in Sicily. The old patriarchal monarchy itself survived in remote corners of Epirus. Traces of it lingered tenaciously on in Sparta. The Greeks, finally, were in frequent contact with barbarian peoples, who almost always had kings. But the Hellenic state of the classical age fluctuated almost always between aristocracy and democracy. Those were the two constant tendencies that were in perpetual conflict within the Greek city-state. Aristotle, in fact, devotes a good part of his immortal Politics to analyzing that inevitable alternation. It is important to note that the Greek conception of aristocracy differed considerably from the Roman conception, which in turn has colored modern usage of the term. For the Greeks of the classical period, the notion of aristocracy was not inseparably bound up with the notion of hereditary power, whereby public offices descend from generation to generation in the same families. Aristocracy meant simply that offices were entrusted, exclusively or preferably, to men who stood out from the mass of other citizens through wealth or exceptional merit, whether or not they descended from ancestors who had been equally prominent. So true is this that Aristotle explicitly distinguishes aristocracy from eugenism, which would mean government by men of families of long-standing prominence, or men of family, pure and simple. And, in fact, it happened not infrequently that some man of family would lead the people against an aristocratic party composed in the majority of men of recent fortune. That was the case with Pericles. But as regards the conflict between aristocracy and democracy, one may say that the Greek state had an aristocratic system whenever wealth succeeded in prevailing over number among the citizens, and a democratic system whenever number prevailed over wealth. Under the aristocratic system, public offices, or at least the more important public offices, when they were not actually restricted by law to citizens with specified property qualifications, paid no salaries. They were accessible only to people who did not have to work for a living in person and day by day. There was no fee for attending meetings of the assembly, and these, accordingly, were unattended by the poor but assiduously attended by the rich and their clients. When the system was democratic, public offices were remunerative, and attendance at the assembly entitled one to a counter, which could be cashed. Under aristocratic regimes, public offices were almost always elective, because at periods of elections the wealthy combined in more or less secret associations, detains, and with plenty of rustling by their clients they could easily manage to concentrate their votes on their own candidates and to outvote the poor, who had no such resources for organizing. Under democratic regimes, public offices were generally distributed by lot among the citizens. That system was justly regarded as absurd, even by thinkers of ancient Greece, but after all it was the only system whereby the influence of reputation, personal connections and financed electioneering could be eliminated. As we have already seen, since the poor were always more numerous than the rich, aristocratic governments leaned heavily on clienteles, which were kept up through the patronage that the man of wealth bestowed on a certain number of the poor, and through the lavishness with which those who were following political careers showered hospitality upon the less pecunious citizens in the mass. Aristotle expressly notes that Pericles was not as rich as Simon, son of Miltiades and leader of the aristocratic party. He could not compete with Simon on the terrain of expenditure. He therefore made a bid to the poor by having many posts, which had formerly carried no stipend, paid for out of the public treasury. That system, making the proper allowances, is not exceptional even today in countries that are democratically ruled. Well known to politicians is the trick of offsetting the influence of private wealth by the squandering of public wealth. Abuse of aristocracy in the Greek state generally lay in the direction of exaggerating the system, that is to say, in transforming aristocracy into oligarchy, in which a closed clique jealously barred from public offices all elements that were not of the clique, whatever their wealth or personal merit. Other frequent abuses resulted when the monopoly of public magistracies was utilized for protecting and increasing the private fortunes of the governing group and of their associates and clients. This was managed more particularly by seeing to it that judgments in civil and criminal eases were handed down by persons who were affiliated with the faction that was ruling the state, or who were loyal to it. Vice versa, at times when poverty was self-respecting, and a majority of the poor would succeed in keeping free of clientage to the rich, abuses of democracy would readily develop. Important public offices would then be given to the men on whom the lots fell, no account being taken of their capacities and aptitudes for filling them. Since the exercise of all public functions was remunerated, the treasury was soon so overloaded that in order to meet the enormous expenditures, burdensome taxes had to be levied on the rich and well-to-do. These amounted to masked confiscations of private fortunes, and the public economy was accordingly upset. Aristotle calculates that in Athens in the day of Pericles about 20,000 citizens were subsidized by the public treasury. This meant that virtually the entire citizenry was transformed into a class of state pensioners. That was possible for a certain length of time, partly because of the income which the city derived from the silver mines of Laurion, but mainly because, as Aristotle again states, the contributions that the allies paid into Athens for the prosecution of the war against Persia were regularly misappropriated. This misappropriation was not by any means the least influential cause among the many that brought on the long and disgraceful war which was soon to break out among the Hellenes, and which came to be called the Peloponnesian War. In graver cases, some popular demagogue would kill off the rich, or else banish them, confiscate their property and divide up the loot among his partisans or among the foreign mercenaries who supported him. This would mean that the normal functioning of the constitution was suspended and that there would be a dictatorship by a leader sustained by a faction. This was called tyranny, and the Greek writers unanimously describe it as the worst of all forms of government. One need hardly say that the normal functioning of the Hellenic state required a high level of economic prosperity and a high grade of intelligence and moral integrity in the majority of citizens. Such things are not easy to procure. In fact, this type of political organization lasted in full efficiency for less than 2 centuries, that is to say, from the beginning of the 5th century BC to the close of the 4th, a period that coincided with the maximum development of Hellenic civilization. Since there was no regular bureaucracy, and no permanent police force entrusted with the execution of the laws, the majority of citizens had to possess a strong sense of legality and the high degree of public spirit that would induce them to sacrifice their individual interests to the public interest. Such virtues therefore were inculcated and celebrated in every possible way by Greek education. That explains in large part the importance that Plato and Aristotle attached to the education of the young, and education was already regarded as one of the functions of the state in ancient Greece. It was also indispensable that a certain numerical proportion should be maintained between citizens and slaves. If the citizens were very few, the slaves were likely to rebel, as the Helots often did at Sparta. On the other hand, if the population of citizens grew too large, then large numbers of them inevitably became paupers and lost interest in the maintenance of their institutions. With an eye to these difficulties, Plato, in the Republic, proposed the abolition of private property and consequently of the family, at least for the ruling class. With greater practical insight, Aristotle recommended building up small property, justly noting that the door stood open to all upheavals when a few very wealthy citizens faced a host of poor ones, who had arms and votes at their disposal but no interest in defending the existing order of things. By the very character of its organic constitution, the Greek state was destined to remain a small affair, its territory never exceeding the limits of a town of moderate size. If the ancient Greeks used one word, polis, to indicate both the state and the city, it was because they could hardly conceive of a state organized in the Hellenic manner that was bigger than one city and the immediately adjacent territory that supplied its means of subsistence. To be sure, when Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire, Greek civilization spread to states of large size, such as the realms of Syria, Egypt, and Macedonia. But those were great military monarchies, and their organization had nothing to do with the political type with which Plato and Aristotle deal. In those monarchies, besides, the Hellenic element was confined to a small ruling class. Greece proper never knew a great state for the reason that the Greek city could not become one. The basis of its organization was the assembly of citizens. In order to attend regularly, one had to live in the city, or in its immediate environs. Nor could the assembly itself be too large. Otherwise the major portion of those present could not hear what the orators were saying. That is why Plato, in the Republic, limits the number of citizens to 5,000. In a plan he devised for an ideal constitution, Hippodamus of Miletus suggested 10,000, and of the 10,000 only a third were to be supplied with arms and so qualified, as Aristotle observes, to take part in public affairs. In the same connection Aristotle speaks of another ideal constitution that was put forward by Phaleas of Chalcedon, proposing an equal distribution of land among the citizens. The Stagirite, again with much good sense, emphasizes the difficulty of establishing such a system and especially of keeping it going afterward. Aristotle himself does not specify a number of citizens. He says that there might be as many as could hear a human voice, and not the voice of Stentor, either, and he adds that all citizens should be able to know each other, in order to judge of each other's aptitudes for public office, a thing that would be impossible if the citizens were too numerous. In her best days, Athens probably had more than 30,000 citizens, but that was an exception. Syracuse had even more than that, But at Syracuse, beginning with the 4th century BC, the normal organization of the Greek city was no longer able to function. In the day of Aristotle, Sparta had fallen to as few as 2,000 or 3,000 citizens, and could arm, he thought, not more than 1,000 fighters. That estimate was probably too low. Aristotle admits that in earlier periods Sparta may have had around 10,000 citizens. The number of warriors, of course, would always be smaller than the number of citizens. As for Athens, Gaetano thinks that in 431 BC, at the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, the period of the city's greatest prosperity, the number of citizens must have reached 45,000, including clerics, Athenian colonists who lived in other cities. To compensate for the impossibility of forming a great state, while keeping the organization of the Hellenic city intact, ancient Greece attempted to apply the principle of hegemony, the supremacy of a large city over a number of smaller ones. The remedy soon showed its awkwardness and inadequacy. As happened with Athens after the Battle of Aegospotami, and with Sparta after Electra, the subject cities reclaimed their independence the moment the dominant capital suffered a reverse. Colonies themselves increased the power of the mother city but slightly, because they too were cities and therefore so many states in themselves, retaining, if anything, a religious or merely sympathetic bond with the city in which they originated. One may reasonably wonder that many of the fundamental concepts which later came to serve as basis for the constitutions of the great modern states of European type should first have been worked out and embodied in such tiny political organisms. To tell the truth, the concept of political liberty was not altogether alien to the peoples of the ancient East and of Egypt. But to them it meant simply that one people should not be subject to another of different race, religion and civilization, and that those who ruled a country should be men of that country and not foreigners. The concept was never interpreted in the sense that a national governmental system could be thought of as servitude from the mere fact that it was absolute and arbitrary. The Old Testament shows that the Hebrews considered themselves enslaved when they were subject to the Amalekites or Philistines, or when they were transported by Nebuchadnezzar to Babylon, but not when they had a national king, though the harsh and arbitrary government of their monarchs was very well described to the elders of Israel by Samuel. It was in ancient Greece that, for the first time, only that people was regarded as politically free, which was subject to laws that the majority of its citizens had approved, and to magistrates to whom the majority itself had delegated fixed powers for fixed periods. It was in Greece that, for the first time, authority was transmitted not from above downward, not from the man who stood at the apex of the political hierarchy to those who were subject to him, but from below upward, from those over whom authority was exercised to those who were to exercise it. In other words, Hellenic civilization was the first to assert, as against the divine right of kings, the human right of peoples to govern themselves. Hellenic civilization was the first to cease looking upon the law as an emanation of the divine will, or of persons acting in the name of the divine will, and to think of it as a human and variable interpretation of a people's will. The authority that the Greek state wielded over its citizens was great. Sometimes it was disposed to regulate even the details of family life. But authority always had to be exercised in accord with norms which a majority had accepted. As we have already seen, those fundamental concepts were adapted as far as possible to European societies of the 18th and 19th centuries, and they have helped effectively to modify European political systems. They have made their influence felt wherever there have been peoples of European origin, and today, through the intellectual contacts that the East is having with Europe and America, they are reverberating in Japan and China and among other peoples of Asiatic civilization.